Uh-oh.
In her last two fights. Good way hitting him from that way down.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Bit of startling news. DAZN and Chief Executive Joe Markowski agreed to split. They are going their separate ways. Didn't see this one coming.
Wow.
DAZN and its North American Chief Executive, who bears a striking resemblance to Harry Potter, Joseph Markowski, have mutually agreed to part ways. Sources connected to the decision confirmed the boxing scene on Friday, following an initial report on the split from Sports Business Journal. An official statement is being prepared for Monday, a DAZN spokesman said. Markowski presided over DAZN's bold entry into boxing, originally separating itself from competitors by streaming high-profile bouts anchored by Saul Canelo Alvarez and others linked to Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions and Eddie Hearns' Matchroom Boxing for an annual subscription fee. Pay-per-view is dead, Marquis flashed at Madison Square Garden as Alvarez made his DAZN debut in a December 2018 trouncing over England's Rocky Fielding. Backed financially by Russia's Len Blavatnik, DAZN worked feverishly to stand as the leader in boxing broadcasting, but because many fighters remained allegiant or contractually bound to the PBC on Showtime and Top Rank on ESPN, DAZN's ambitions were defused. Ultimately, DAZN entered the pay-per-view business while finally streaming the Alvarez vs. Gennady Golovkin trilogy bout in 2022, 3 years after it seemed ripest to occur.
When DAZN debuted in America, they made a splash, a big one, throwing a lot of money around, paying well in excess for fights and well in excess of what some fighters were worth in an effort to procure American fighters and American talent.
There were losses, but that was expected. Most who can't seem to wrap their mind around calculated losses you know you're going to take.
Because you have to.
When you're breaking into a new market or you're starting up a business, any kind of business really, in the early goings of it, there are going to be losses. That's what makes them calculated losses. You know they're going to happen, but they're necessary.
Comes to DAZN, they overpaid for some fights, they overpaid for some fighters. That's just when it comes to boxing. Outside of boxing, procuring the sports rights to certain sports abroad.
Not exclusive to boxing, those losses, those were calculated losses too, often misrepresented by many a content creator here on YouTube.
Can't see the forest through the trees.
As some casted DAZN's boxing entry as one rife with wasteful spending, creating a culture of decreased activity and one that didn't solve boxing's decades-long plague of protective matchmaking.
Who wrote this?
Lance Pugmire, who used to write for the LA Times.
The next time Lance wants to write an article about decreased activity among fighters, he should write one about the PBC, not Matchroom or DAZN.
Are you listening, Lance? DAZN featured some classic bouts during Markowski's years, including Andy Ruiz Jr.'s stunning 2019 upset of heavyweight champion Anthony Joshua in what was his U.S. debut at MSG, Dimitri Bivol's big upset of Canelo Alvarez, and a slew of entertaining super flyweight bouts.
Classic women's bouts.
Real barn burners in Ebony Bridges versus Shannon Courtenay, real barn burners in Terry Harper versus Natasha Jonas, an all-time classic in Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano, as well as Katie versus Chantel Cameron.
Got a lot of good fights while Joe was over there.
Over recent months, Markowski has been replaced by Alfie Sharman as the streaming company's public face during fight weeks, and that arrangement is expected to continue as DAZN will announce the hiring of IMG's Michael Ridout in a less public senior position supervising rights agreements. Markowski, after 13 years with DAZN, has yet to announce what he'll do next. His tenure there predates DAZN's US debut.
By the time they debuted in America, he was already working for them.
Why did he leave? Was he asked to?
And this is how they're dressing it up for the public.
Did he willfully leave? Did he decide he wants to do something else? It's up for debate, but what isn't? What's not up for debate is that DAZN here and now is on much more stable ground than they were when they debuted here in America in 2018. 2018, they were only really operating out of 9 countries, whereas now they're operating out of 170, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Before, I think they had something like 13 or 14 million subscribers. Here today, they have 60 million around the world.
And have effectively outlasted the PBC, outlasted Showtime, that tried to turn their nose up at the platform.
Kept telling everybody it's just an app. It's just an app. Hey, idiot. Netflix is an app. Hulu is an app. Amazon Prime.
I told you DAZN was going to be just fine. I told you DAZN was going to do all right, whereas Showtime...
You see what happened.
Here today, DAZN isn't just working with Matchroom as a promotional outfit in boxing, or Golden Boy as a promotional outfit in boxing. It's not just those two. They've given broadcast deals to Dimitri Salita and OTX.
Smaller promotional outfits than Matchroom and Golden Boy
that allow them to diversify their catalog of fights and their catalog of content overall. They are much bigger now, much bigger now than they were in 2018. And their presence in the sport, not just the sport, but in sports overall, is more felt.
Then why did Joe leave?
Maybe he was asked to, and they didn't want to make it public.
The direction they're going in, maybe they didn't feel like they needed Joe anymore, or maybe Joe didn't feel like he needed them. He wants to do something else.
Write Harry Potter books, maybe be a stunt double in the next Harry Potter movie. He could do it.
You can do it, Joe.
Who knows? We may never know what the real circumstances of Joe's departure from DAZN are, but what we do know is that they are bigger now than they were before, operating out of more territories.
Better understanding of the boxing market and what moves the needle.
Wish Joe all the best, and whatever he decides to get into. Things are shaking, rattling, and rolling in the world of boxing.
Not everybody's happy about it.
Veteran fighter and Hall of Fame inductee Froch isn't happy about it. He says Saudi Arabia's millions are ruining boxing.
I don't see how. If not for their millions, some of these fights we're getting wouldn't even happen.
Froch was the guest of honor at a lunch hosted by the Boxing Writers Club and was reflecting on the opportunities in life boxing had given him when he then said, "It's being ruined by Saudi Arabia at the minute. The money is killing it. There's a lot of money floating around and not enough getting put back into the grassroots boxing and not enough going into the aftercare of boxing and retired fighters and injured fighters. Some of them, hundreds of millions being invested, could go to the British Boxing Board of Control and be used to look after fighters. I'm speaking to Eddie Hearn in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to try and suggest something. But unfortunately, most people are greedy, most people are selfish. It's just inherent."
He's not exempted from that.
Nobody in boxing is, because if Farrell Crotch were an active fighter here today, if he were still fighting, do you think he'd stand on principle, or do you think he'd take those Saudi millions the same as everybody else?
You know he would.
What, he's going to stand on principle? He's going to say, well, I'm not going to fight unless it's on UK soil.
Give me a break, Carl.
I'm not calling anybody out. I'm not putting Eddie Hearn in that bracket, but promoters and top fighters only think about one thing, and that's themselves. And that's the sport we're involved in as well. Unfortunately, Eddie Hearn's Matchroom were promoting Froch when he earned his biggest purses in his rematch with Mikhail Kessler and twice against Groves. There's a lot of money in it at the top level, he said, so I don't think it's good for it.
Why not?
Make it make sense. In what way are these cash injections from Saudi Arabia into the sport of boxing having an adverse effect on it, when many of the fights that we're getting, we wouldn't be getting at all if not for them? When you think about fights like Dimitri Bivol versus Artur Beterbiev.
Do you understand that that fight was dead in the water? Do you understand that if not for the Saudis, we wouldn't be getting it at all?
Do you think that Top Rank was going to send Artur over to Matchroom? Or do you think Top Rank was going to pay Dimitri to come to them? Pay the cost, pay to play.
The reality of it is, if not for them, we wouldn't be getting that fight at all. I think if not for them, we wouldn't be getting Fury versus Usyk. Do you remember what happened after talks initially collapsed and they tried to do it in the UK?
Remember that at first it was supposed to go down in Saudi. That didn't work out. They tried to do it in the UK, and that didn't work out either.
If not for Turkey Al-Sheikh, if not for the Saudis, we wouldn't be getting the undisputed title fight.
We wouldn't be getting getting it at heavyweight. We wouldn't be getting it at light heavyweight. We wouldn't be getting the Matchroom versus Queensberry show on the undercard of the undisputed title fight at light heavyweight. Promoters are actually working together. Long-standing rivals.
What the fuck is Carl talking about?
Do you understand that? Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren are finally working together, and you're saying this is bad for boxing? In what way?
How?
His argument seems to be that it's taking money and taking attention away from grassroots boxing, domestic boxing in the UK. I'm going to assume he's talking about the UK, but
That's bullshit too.
here's how.
How?
The Saudis being the ones to bankroll these very big shows, these very expensive shows. It's not coming out of Frank's annual budget at Queensberry,
It's not coming out of Eddie's annual budget at Matchroom.
where normally Matchroom would be paying for Dimitri Bivol's fights and Jai Opetaya's and Anthony Joshua's. The Saudis are footing the bill.
Same with Queensberry, where normally they'd be the ones paying for Nick Ball's fights and Tyson Fury's fights.
Some of these fighters are expensive. Some of these fights, to put them together, they cost a lot of money. They take up a sizable chunk out of the annual budget. But when the Saudis are paying those fighters, when the Saudis are paying to make those shows happen, that takes the burden off of the promoters, which then creates a cash surplus they can use to do other fights involving other fighters.
Domestically,
Or abroad, like Matchroom does, because now you've got more money to play since you didn't have to spend so much of it making Anthony's next fight or Dimitri's next fight, Jai Opetaya's next fight.
next fights.
Why do you think the people at Matchroom and DAZN decided they're not going to build Jack Catterall versus Josh Taylor 2 as a pay-per-view? They're going to make it a regular fight as part of your regular DAZN subscription. Why do you think that happened?
Remember, Sky Sports were going to do it. They were going to do it at first, but they wanted to bill it as a pay-per-view.
DAZN and Matchroom got it, and they decided they're going to make it a regular fight as part of your regular subscription. Why?
The Saudis are the ones paying so many of their other fighters. That's why.
It's not coming out of Matchroom's pocket, so Matchroom can afford to pay Josh and pay Jack what they want to get paid and not bill it as a pay-per-view at the same time, to then make the fight more available to that many more people, since it's not behind a paywall.
I don't know what the fuck Carl is talking about.
Sometimes Carl says something, I might agree with it. Other times he says something, I don't. And I don't see how Saudi Arabian cash injections into boxing are ruining the sport when all they're doing is making the fights that the sport couldn't make on its own. Left to its own devices, we wouldn't be getting Usyk versus Fury. We wouldn't be getting Bivol versus Better Beef or Matchroom versus Queensberry. So what the fuck is this guy talking about?
Well, you got people in boxing, they like to pretend they're standing on principle. They like to pretend they're doing that.
When all it really is you don't benefit from what's going on, so you want to be Debbie Downer. You want to be a wet blanket.
What are you supposed to be, the patron saint for the domestic boxing scene?
Domestic boxing scene's not missing any action right now, so maybe some of the bigger fights are happening in Saudi.
A few of the bigger ones, but not all of them.
Stop exaggerating, Carl, and stop pretending that you're any less self-serving than anyone else in the sport of boxing, because if you were still around and you were still fighting and they offered you some money to go over there, you'd be over there with everybody else.
Cut the crap.
Now, as it pertains to the big fights happening in Saudi, one of the biggest on the calendar, the people at IFL TV posed a question in reference to the Alexander Usyk versus Tyson Fury fight, asking if the winner should be ranked as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. The answer may vary depending on who you ask. If I am to address this question, I feel that the winner of the fight should be pound-for-pound #1, so long as the winner is Alexander Usyk.
But not Tyson Fury.
It would be a redundancy to name Tyson Fury a career heavyweight who's only ever fought as a heavyweight, the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport. It's a redundancy to even have a career heavyweight on a pound-for-pound list. What is a career heavyweight?
A fighter who's only ever fought as a heavyweight.
That's Fury. That's not Usyk. What Usyk is a guy who moved up from cruiserweight up to heavyweight.
What's the difference?
The empirical question, as it pertains to the pound-for-pound list, irrespective of whose pound-for-pound list you're talking about, the empirical question is, if they were all the same size based on skill, who would win?
With any other fighter, On any version of the pound-for-pound list that's out there, whoever's ranked at number 1, it's likely figurative. It's figurative when you say Terrence Crawford is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport because he's not actually at heavyweight.
It's figurative when you say Naoya Inoue is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport because as good as he is, he's not actually at heavyweight. And the empirical question is...
And he never will be. Or Terrence, or many of the fighters that are on the list right now. Only one of them is there.
Alexander Usyk.
Go back to the list's origins.
To the days of Sugar Ray Robinson. Sugar Ray, who's often dubbed the unofficial father of the pound-for-pound list, the poster child on the premise that in his heyday, he was thought of as being a better and more skilled fighter than the more popular heavyweights of his era.
Even though he was smaller.
And even though he might lose a fight to a heavyweight in a real-life setting, it wouldn't be because the heavyweight was better, a better boxer. It wouldn't be because the heavyweight was better, simply bigger.
So if Sugar were the same size as a heavyweight with the skills that he has, who would win?
The feeling was that Sugar would win, because he's more skilled than a heavyweight. If you tack on the size, there's no beating this guy.
With Sugar, it was figurative. For many fighters that have ever been ranked at number 1 on a pound-for-pound list, most of the time, it's figurative. It's not literal, because they're not actually at heavyweight fighting heavyweights, whereas this guy...
This guy is. What is the shining testament to Alexander Usyk's skills, his skills, is that he's taken his skills on the road and won every single title he's ever won on the road.
And won decisions on the road, which we all know is very difficult to do, because you could get jobbed. You could get robbed.
Many fighters do. He's made it so emphatic in his contests, they have to give it to him.
And they have. That's how good he is.
So when you think about that, and you think about how for Alexander Usyk, the empirical question when it comes to pound for pound and being the number 1 pound for pound fighter, it's not figurative for him. It's literal. He's really up there right now.
He's already a champion up there right now.
And if he beats Tyson Fury to become a 2-time undisputed champion in the 4-belt era at cruiserweight, at heavyweight, I'd say he is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport, the most literal incarnation of that.
With Terrence, it's just a postulation. With Inoue or anybody else, it's just a thesis, a hypothesis.
With Usyk, it would be literal, that his skill, not his size, because he's not bigger than those guys up there, not his power, because he's not necessarily stronger, but he's more skilled.
His skills overcame their size, which is what pound for pound is all about.
That the fighter, the smaller fighter, in spite of not having as many pounds as the bigger fighter, he's still the better fighter. That 221 pounds of Alexander Usyk possesses more skill than 277 pounds of Tyson Fury.
Comprendo, friendo.
That's if Usyk wins. If Usyk loses, no, Tyson Fury doesn't get in. He's no example of how skill overcomes size when he has all the size. He's got more size than most heavyweights, let alone fighters fighting below heavyweight, so he's no example of a pound-for-pound fighter, let alone the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter.
You're gonna pretend that his size isn't an advantage when all people can ever say about Fury in this fight is that he's too big.
Too big, too strong.
He's gonna mow him down.
Sounds to me like an evaluation that only speaks to Tyson Fury's size, or mostly speaks to Tyson Fury's size, because he has it. So how could he be the example of skill overcoming size?
He can't.
It's a redundancy, which is why he's not even on my list, and he's not going to be even if he wins. Pound-for-pound lists are generally not for career heavyweights.
Do you understand that?